Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm rather sobered after listening to Margaret's description of food during Germany, because British soldiers, as you'll discover, thought they had it very bad indeed. So we have to bear in mind that their context was a very different one from the starving families in blockaded Germany. As I say, it kind of seems a bit cheap in a way that the soldiers were so upset about some of the food they received, having just heard about that. But as we know, food is about a lot more than just calories. So the British Army might have been very pleased indeed with its calorie ration. You know, it looked good on paper. And even if it were delivered in full, you know, British soldiers weren't necessarily happy with what they received. They were concerned about, in general, the lack of variety, kind of unfamiliarity of foodstuffs. You know, all of us, I think, can perhaps relate to that kind of tension between getting bored with food, but also being rather afraid of trying something new. And anyone who's ever had experience of trying to feed young children will recognise that very well indeed. You know, that this kind of, food is a kind of, it's an intrusive thing. You know, I'm not a kind of psychoanalytical historian, you'll be pleased to hear, no doubt, but it is a kind of, you know, it is from the mother's breast, the consumption of food tells us all sorts of different things other than just the physiological. It's about emotional relationships, it's about social relationships, it's about all sorts of different things. But for the army, it was primarily about logistics. You're an army commander, you're not too worried about how the men are feeling necessarily, although of course food and morale, come together very importantly, but mainly for the British Army it's a question of logistics, shipping huge quantities of food out to, and my research is mainly on the Western Front, because of course you have a whole set of different problems when you start trying to feed people in Mesopotamia, Gallipoli, and you know, the very different theatres of war in which Britain operated. But as we'll see from Sergeant Eachus, this is a diary in the Imperial War Museum, he took it very poorly, the fact that the food he received from the British Army was not what he expected. Now, it's not a kind of cherry-picked bit from a diary. It's a diary packed with resentment towards the army, but a lot of it expressed in terms of the poor food that he received. And he's not an ironic man either. He meant it. He's very, very unhappy. Why are soldiers so unhappy? Well, they're so unhappy because they obviously are being asked to risk their lives in service of their country, and they feel that the government for whom they're doing that has a duty of care to feed them properly, to look after them. And food, of course, as we know from what I said earlier, food is essential as a medium, a vehicle of expressing care. So poor food was taken by soldiers, you know, in a far more profound way than just feeling slightly hungry or slightly dissatisfied. You know, soldiers became very resentful. There were disturbances in the British Army, not just at Etaples in 1917, but in other training camps earlier than that. And a lot of them are around food, the fact that people weren't very happy with the rations they were receiving. They're very rarely about not having any food, they're about having food that they didn't particularly like. So food is a kind of, important locus in which broader dissatisfactions with army life and British Army, general position of men could be expressed. Now, I'm not a comparative historian, and we have a German historian here who might be able to give us, and of course Anna from Sweden, but the British have always been somewhat derided, I think, for the narrowness of their diet, particularly at this period in time. Slightly earlier in this period of time, Voltaire had said that the British had 42 religions, but only 2 sources. So British people, and the British working classes in particular, who lived very much on a diet of bread, you know, and potatoes and a bit of bacon, but not that much bacon, were rather, you know, they'd been trained to be quite narrow in their eating habits. So Donald McGill, who did his fat lady funny seaside postcards, he also did one about food, which kind of expressed a lot of, that would kind of chime with the response of many of the rank and file soldiers of the British Army. I don't think you'd ever seen sauerkraut, because it's green here, isn't it, when of course it's white. But anyway, blood sausage, smelly cheese, you know, all these things were indicative. You are what you eat, you know, and these people ate strange and rather unpleasant things, which told you a lot about them, obviously. So when I talked about the ration scale, I put some comparative ration scales up there. The British, that's about right, that's about what the modern British Army offers its soldiers today, just over 4,000 calories. As you can see, God, I'm going to be making these terrible racist comments. Who gets the most food? It's the Americans. The Americans get the most food, but obviously they're not eating it for very long, but we won't go into that, only a year. But the German ration, again, looks good on paper. The French ration looks very good on paper, well, mainly because a big part of that was made up with 0.8 pints of wine a day, which the British soldiers were rather envious of because they got a tablespoonful of rum if they were lucky. The French ration does look a bit sparse. French soldiers, frontline soldiers, were actually given 35 centimes a day to supplement their diet. I'm not quite sure, places on the front line, it would be hard to find supplements to your diet, but they are given a kind of cash equivalent, which did happen in British training camps, but not so much on the front line. The British diet is very much about meat. If it were fresh meat, the soldiers probably would have been not displeased with it, but it was generally tinned. Huge importation of tinned corned beef, bully beef from South America in the main. The British Army loves bully beef because it's easily transportable, it doesn't perish, it kind of fits all together very nicely in the trains. It was a joy for the logistics manager, but British soldiers don't find it palatable. They're not used to eating tinned meat. It's salty, it's dry, it's relatively high fat content. You need something with it to kind of break it down and make it palatable. But what mainly came with it was not fresh bread, but biscuits. So kind of hardtack biscuit, which again has this kind of non-perishability, which is very popular with the army, but not very popular with many of the soldiers, because of dentistry was not something which working class soldiers would have had any experience of pre-war. Working class people go to the dentist. The army did offer a whole interesting study of dentistry out there in the army, and their first solution was to whip all your teeth out and give you free false ones, which didn't necessarily make soldiers or help them very much, in terms of being able to eat hard substances. But teeth were a real problem, and not helped as well by what was probably a diet that was lacking in vitamin C, because fresh potatoes were the kind of main vegetable, but they often didn't turn up. And after the hard winter that Margaret mentioned of 1916 and the poor harvest of 1917, potatoes are in relatively short supply. The British Army has gardens in the Western Front, allotment-type gardens, and grows quite large quantities of fruit and vegetables. Soldiers are never very keen to work on those because they felt they were supposed to be in reserve and having a break, but they were ordered out, to do lots of weeding and hoeing and planting. And of course the issue for them was they might not be around when the crop came good, and they resented kind of putting all that effort in so that other people could benefit. But kind of, on paper, good rations, but low in fat. Even on the paper, the kind of fresh vegetables, not huge quantities, and so they were rarely delivered. It was mainly, for the British troops, it would mainly be some potatoes if you were lucky. Got tea, you've got sugar. I mentioned those two together because they were often distributed together. They would mix tea leaves with sugar because it was easier, and most people drank tea with sugar. If you didn't, there's accounts of people spending a long time with a feather trying to separate the tea leaves from the sugar. But that was, for ease of logistics, it was much better for the army to distribute them in that way. This is my collection of First World War food postcards. I won't ask who else in the room collects such things. I fear I may be alone. But this, I kind of like this one because I think this, I don't know where it's from. There's nothing on the back to indicate where it was taken. But anyway, I think the soldiers who received this set of rations would not have been displeased because we can see fresh bread, very important. We can see fresh meat or bacon or some kind of fresh meat there. And we've got tins of bully, but it's not just that. So they're kind of setting up a ration distribution there that looks relatively appealing. Now, I shouldn't deride, and I don't deride, the British Army's logistical procedures, because they were hugely complex. And of course, they'd never had to do this before. Previously, armies, had mainly been fed off the hoof. When you sent an expeditionary force out to the Peninsula or even the Boer War, you got a handbook that told you how to kill cattle and butcher them, and what you could scavenge from the countryside around, what you could buy from the retailers. But of course, that's not going to work when you've got 1.8 million British soldiers on the Western Front in March 1918. Huge numbers of men. So the British government gets a very complex system going. On the left here, the little square is the base supply depot, and there were a series of these on the coast, Calais, Boulogne, and they had huge warehouses that held stocks of tinned and fresh food. Photographs of those in a moment. Every day, a train was set up with a division load of food and supplies and pushed up to the front. So this is what the first line is. There you have a regulating station in the middle, because not every base supply depot had every type of food. For example, some of them didn't have freezers. So what you'd have to do is get to the regulating station and swap goods across trains, so to split out the meat and then split the other things. So everybody all the trains would meet up, or they'd be held there till the next one came to make sure it was all spread properly. Then we've got the railhead. And at that point, it then goes into what's called, which I found rather confusing when I first looked at that, is the kind of things like we've got the motor transport first, the solid line, but then you've got the divisional train. When I kept reading about them, I think, right, another train? But this is actually horses, because although it's a mechanised war, horses and mules are used extensively to pull not just ordnance, but also the food up towards the front line. Eventually, it ends up with it being divvied up by the local quartermaster, and people then running it up to the trench, often in wheelbarrows, sometimes in sacks. It just depends in what kind of position you are. But a very complex system that in the main worked very well indeed. The only times it breaks down, in the spring offensive of 1918, and of course, it doesn't really get going in Mons in the late summer, autumn of 1914. But in the main, because it's a static war, the kind of system works pretty well. And here we have a Calais-based supply depot with huge quantities of onions being shoveled into sacks. The Army Service Corps, or Ali Soper's cavalry, or I think the favourite was Anglais sans courage. Very rude about the ASC frontline soldiers, because they feel, there's kind of lurking in the back. They wrote whole manuals about how to pack a train, and anyone who's kind of taken a bag back from the supermarket and found a crushed packet of tortilla chips in the bottom of it will know how important it is to get that right. And these were not people, men were not domesticated at this point. Men did not do cooking, shopping, not working class men. This was what women did for them. Unless their wife was laid up, with another baby, then maybe they might do a little bit of it inside the house, but they kept it quiet. So men were not used to cooking, were not used to dealing with food. So this all had to be taught to them. You get a sense as well as what had to be taught, in that the first lesson in the British Army Manual for Cookery is you must wash out the Dixie after you've had stew and before you make the tea. So, you kind of think, well, duh, but the fact they had to spell it all out to people because they just had no idea, what needed to be done. Now, as I mentioned before, fresh bread was very much part of 19th century working class diet. British working classes, rural and urban, ate huge quantities of bread, often without fat, just with jam, but it's very, very important. Didn't like the biscuit, so the army tried to resolve this issue by setting up a load of mobile bakeries that travel all over France, getting as close as they can to the front line, but trying to ensure that soldiers get access to the fresh bread that they, were so fond of. They have to think as well about the logistics of carrying hot food up to the trenches. Originally, men had been sent up there with the dixies in each hand, but that had proved very difficult because some of the trenches are very difficult to negotiate, and you needed your hands to, stop yourself slipping and falling. So they developed these pan packs. You can see the soldiers there on the right, where food was packed into, big baskets with straw to insulate it, and they would try and get food up to the front line. It depends where you were. If you're on the Ypres salient, you're not going to get any of this. You're going to go up there with some tins of biscuit and bully beef, and you'll just sit it out for 3-4 days or however long you had to be there. But for other areas, it was possible to get hot food up to the troops. And of course, it's so important in terms of morale, in terms of showing care, in terms of showing commitment, to the men. A biscuit was, an example of where the men felt very hard done by. A lot is made of hardtack biscuit. In jokes, Robert Graves makes a lot of starting fires. Bruce Bairn's father has lots of old Bill cartoons of them being used, on the fire to, get the flames going. But it was problematic, biscuit, because it is so hard. And if you haven't got good teeth, you really, it's all right if you've got time to grind it down and then heat it with a tin of condensed milk and some jam, as many soldiers did, into a porridge. But you can't do that if you're in the front line. You can't have fires up there. So they're left with a biscuit that they cannot eat. And because of the poor diet, although the army wouldn't have recognised it at the time, although scurvy was widely understood and had been for hundreds of years, vitamins, people like Henrietta Chick in Vienna post-war, they're the ones who actually discover the true physiological aspects of vitamins and their deficiencies. But there's a lot of evidence of soldiers with boils, with bruising easily, with teeth that become loose and gums that bleed, and things that I think now medical people would recognise as a kind of pre-scurvy condition resulting from a deficiency in vitamin C. So, soldiers struggled with these biscuits. Well, some of them struggled. Some of them used their initiative and made rather lovely things out of them. They're often used as canvases in dugouts. There's lots of Nicholas Saunders in his book on trench art has some lovely images of paintings that were done on hardtack biscuits. There's some in the Imperial War Museum where they put a stamp on it and sent it home. This is what we have to eat. I don't know if it actually went through the post service or it's given to them afterwards, actually, thinking about it, because you weren't allowed to comment adversely on food because that was detrimental to morale. So censored letters would prevent anything too bad about food going home. Mobile kitchens are very important as well. We've seen the pan packs, but obviously you can't bring them up 20 miles from behind. You want to get your ovens up as close as you can. So this is a kind of a stationary temporary kitchen. But on the right here, just behind the Somme in 1916, these are ovens on wheels. So they would, when men marched, men spent a lot of time marching between their different positions at the front, behind the front line, and these would go with them. Great vats of, I think it was euphemistically called stew, which covered Rogerson's book, 10 Days on the Somme. He says, it's marvellous. We put everything in there, kippers, beef, all goes together. And you think, well, it's marvellous for you as an officer because you're not eating it. Whether the men thought it was marvellous or not, well, clearly a lot of them didn't. A lot of it depends on the skill of the cooks. I pause there because mainly they weren't very skilled. They trained huge numbers of them, but it's very basic and they're only as good as their ingredients and their recipes. So, as I said, bully beef is a kind of feature. So the recipe for fish paste in the army cookbook, the predominant ingredient is bully beef. So I'm not sure what bully beef mashed up with sardines tastes like, but I'm quite sure I probably wouldn't want to experience it. But these are the kind of the recipes that the trained soldier cooks were being asked to produce. It wasn't just about army rations. I'll just say briefly that soldiers had opportunities for other sources of food. Thou Shalt Not Steal, a very nice pastel by John Singer Sargent on the front of a terrific book called The Stomach for Fighting, which I should shamelessly plug because it's now out in paperback. Hooray! But soldiers stealing apples from the orchard, lots of theft. The French hated the British troops, the French farmers. And, they're hungry and they've got a boring diet. So the response of many of their officers, Captain Dunn, for example, talks about complaints being made to him, and his response to the men is, do it after dark. Just try not to get caught at it, because their officers knew that they would need, if they could supplement the diet, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Lots of French farmers took up the initiative, or their wives here, set up little estaminets, because it's all right if you're an officer, you've got a horse, or you can get motor transport to Amiens and go to one of the nice cafes there. But if you're a rank and file soldier, you don't have access to transport. So when you're in reserve, you get what's local. And what was local was these little cafes where you could try wine. You weren't allowed, British rank and file soldier wasn't allowed to touch spirits. That was against regulations. But wine and beer was acceptable. A postcard from the Daily Mail. A lot of soldiers were asked to help with the French harvests because French men were away, which they didn't really like doing, but I think there was a possibility that they might get some kind of interaction with the opposite sex, and are they only discussing potatoes was the caption on it, that there was a kind of romantic possibility of doing some work with the French families. And of course canteens. This is a rather lovely looking canteen with lots of stuff piled in the background. I was quite impressed when I saw it. It's in the Imperial War Museum collection, but this was staged for a photographer. So, when often men do write, Frederick Manning, for example, in her private suite, about getting to the canteen and finding that all they've got is, boot polish and, a box of matches. They weren't always very well stocked. It was kind of a bit, random. But talking about food parcels, as Margaret was earlier, and the illegality of them to the home front in Germany, they were something to be encouraged. The British Army saw them as, as a way of keeping the men happy. And they're not only about food. Many other things are sent, writing materials, drugs, all sorts of different things. Food is sent back as well. The British Army has to stop British soldiers at the beginning of the war from sending butter back from France, because they bought it in the markets and sent it home to their families because it was quite cheap there. But as you can imagine, it was somewhat messy. But one private P.H. Jones wrote home and letter in the Imperial War Museum, and he says, I think my idea of hell would be the front without parcels, because they were a way of communicating with home. And of course food, and the demographic of this army, which is young, the majority of people would be communicating with mothers. So mothers made food and soldiers asked for it, and they liked homemade food. It's a class thing there, probably. Middle class is perhaps not so keen because they all went to boarding school at 8 or 9, but working class men, just send me this lovely Stouffer letter collection in Ipswich. I could just eat a bit of your batter pudding, Mum, and they kind of, that taste of home, it really does, that kind of food that's made for you by someone who loves you. And this image from the War Illustrated, my last slide here, shows a Christmas pudding, which really absolutely encapsulates that idea that it was made at home and it creates that kind of connection with the men in the trenches. And soldiers relied heavily on them, and it was very important to share them with their fellow soldiers as well, their little group of friends. And another private, Jones, C.R. Jones this time, wrote home rather wistfully, I am rather in the cold because fellows are continually getting parcels, and sort of, berates his family a little bit about why they're not sending them. Those letters are in the Imperial War Museum. He was killed on the 15th of September 1916, and subsequently his family had annotated the letters before they gave them to the Imperial War Museum, saying we've checked our records and we sent him a parcel every 2 weeks. And I'm always so, profoundly touched by the fact that his family were willing to give his private letters to the Imperial War Museum, but they wanted to make it very clear that they had done their absolute utmost to support their son when he was in extremity in the trenches. And not easy for working class families, especially when you had 2 or 3 sons serving in the trenches. A great burden, it comes through in some letters, to try and keep that going. But okay, I'll end there. There's lots more to be said, but probably for another day, hopefully. But thank you very much indeed. Any questions?
Can you say something about the alcohol ration in the front line and the reserve trench?
The one at sergeants. Never got beyond the sergeants were all the songs, weren't they? Sergeants had the rum ration. Well, I think it actually translates. I don't know what the old imperial measure is, but it's basically 2 tablespoonfuls of rum was given every day to soldiers in the frontline trenches. It was not the case because it didn't always get to the front. When it did get to the front, soldiers were very pleased to see it on one hand, but somewhat distressed on the other because it generally got to the front before a push. So soldiers regarded rum arriving as it should do, as they did maybe hot bacon for breakfast. You didn't get a good feeling about it because, you know, on the 1st of July 1916, many soldiers had a very good breakfast, but, you know. But it was part of, I say, it's a kind of traditional part of the British Army, isn't it, providing alcohol for their troops.
Yes, I was wondering about water supply.
Ah, yes. And very heavy, of course, transportation of water, you know, because it's such a heavy material to transport. Well, this is a big issue for the British Army. It has big tankers, rather like the ovens we saw. It puts big tankers on wheels and takes them round. It transports water in petrol cans, which again hadn't been fully washed out, so soldiers are very angry about getting water that tastes, you know, of oil. On hot days, I mean, I have found an account that says a man drank his own urine. He was so dehydrated. I don't know if that's, you know, it's a kind of novelised account rather than a straight memoir. But it was a real problem because what soldiers would do if the water, fresh water, didn't arrive was they would drink from puddles. And of course, you know, you're fighting on fields that have already been fought over after 1914. So when the puddles drained, you know, you would find bodies or so digestive disturbances are a big feature of you know, dysentery, you know, terrible stomach complaints, and some of them extend after the war as well. I think permanent stomach troubles.
You might have thought they would have soaked their hardtack in water if it was good enough.
But it was limited at the front, you see, because it was so heavy. You know, it's not something you can easily transport up to front lines. Soldiers carried iron rations, which would include a flask of water, but they were not supposed to touch those until an officer had given them permission to do so. So, you know, it's an acknowledgement that, you know, those supplies are quite precious, water as well as food. Yes, Margaret.
Well, having dealt a lot with chocolate, I wonder what about this chocolate ratio for? I know from the Germans, not only World War I, but also World War II, that small pieces of chocolate were very important, and they tried to supply the army with chocolate, especially during World War II, when they even had the so-called, well, I call it in English, pilot chocolate. That was chocolate with drugs in it, so that
keep it awake, speed,
when they not only vitamin, but when they were shut down, so that they could survive, because cavetin and other drugs helped them to survive for a couple of days. And I'm not sure, but I think I found in a museum in London a so-called small ration, especially for soldiers, chocolate. And I remember now when the beginning of the Afghan war and the first German soldiers went there, they sent letters home. What we miss most is chocolate.
Yeah,
so
but
because it's nourishing and.
I don't think the British have the same relationship with chocolate that Germans do at this point in time, For British soldiers, chocolate was a treat. It wasn't part of the ration. It was provided, something like the Christmas boxes, you know, Princess Mary, you know, and Queen Alexandra do these Christmas boxes. There would be chocolate in that as a gift. And where it would come from would be from the comforts funds that were set up by the regiments or the battalions. The wife of the senior officer would organise kind of charitable donations and contributions and convert that into treats for the soldiers. And chocolates, hard chocolate, and drinking chocolate was part of that. But I've never seen it as part of the regular ration in British. For a British soldier, a big treat would not be chocolate, it would be a steamed pudding, you know, some kind of sweet pudding, jam, syrup, spotted dick type pudding. Yeah, very different eating cultures, really. And boiled sweets I've seen more mention of, you know. And of course cigarettes. I don't know where, you know. a way of suppressing appetite as well a bit, I suppose, isn't it? Yes.
Did they manage to maintain the supply of tea?
Oh, yes, as far as I'm aware, yes.
Because it would have been easier to transport, and the army still moves on its tea.
Yeah. And coffee is not something, you know, that the British Army ever had much truck with. Certainly not the rank and file. Because what I'm talking about here is the rank and file soldiers. You know, officers ate very differently, because officers in the British Army, I don't know how it works in Germany or any other army, but in Britain, officers pay into a mess. You know, they group together and they pay each day, week or whatever, and they buy their own food quite often and have someone, rank and file soldiers would cook it for them, but they would not, unless they're in the front line, a la Journey's End. Has anyone seen the latest version of the film of Journey's End? I thought it was fantastic. So if you get a chance, it didn't get much of a circulation, but in that, for example, they have officers in a front line dugout where they do get to eat British Army rations, but in the main, so officers were not reliant on them. They would have other sources and, you know, wealthier, able to buy additional food. Okay, thank you very much.